We continue on page 6 here. The surrender happens of its own accord. It just dawns on me. Then, peace of mind settles in and my life starts to get more manageable. It's by Bob T. Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over others, that our lives had become unmanageable. This is step 1 of CODA, C-O-D-A. The first time I heard this step, I didn't get it. I didn't understand. It felt dark, scary, and untrue. Powerless over others? My life unmanageable? I thought I was in complete control of myself and others. I thought there was no circumstance too overwhelming, no feeling so great that I couldn't handle it by sheer force of willpower. I thought being in control was expected of me. It was my job. That's how I got through life. And I thought my life looked so much more manageable than the lives of those around me, until I started looking within. That's when I found the undercurrent of fear, anger, pain, loneliness, emptiness, and unmet needs that had controlled me most of my life. That's when I took my eyes off the other person long enough to take a look at the state of affairs in my life. That's when I began to find a life and come alive. I didn't know about power and powerlessness, said Mary, talking about the first step. Being a victim and being in control was how I was in power. If I was powerless, then someone else was in control. Now we are learning a better way to own our power than being victims and being controlling. It begins by admitting and accepting the truth about ourselves and our relationships. We are powerless over others. When we try to exert power where we have none, our lives at some level may become unmanageable. Let's take a look at some ways unmanageability can present itself in our lives, and where ideas about controlling others or allowing them to control us began. Okay, hang on, gotta wet the whistle. We've got coffee cappuccino from Tank and Tummy today. Shout out to my lady friends. I appreciate y'all and all your kindness to me over these many years. If you see them, give them my love. Alright, we continue. My story. I can still remember the scene vividly, even though it happened more than a decade ago. Someone I cared about a lot was drinking. He was an alcoholic, and he wouldn't stop. I had done everything I could to make him stop. Nothing worked. Nothing. Neither was I able to stop my efforts to control his drinking. After yet another round of promises, forgiveness, then broken promises, I settled on the ultimate plan to make him stop drinking. I would show him how it felt to love someone who was using chemicals. I would make it look like I had returned to drug usage. That would get his attention. That would show him how much I hurt. Then he would surely stop. Carefully, I set the stage. Although I had been clean of drugs for years, I laid out the paraphernalia of a user. A small packet with white powder in it. I used sugar. A spoon burnt on one side. A piece of cotton in the spoon. Then I lay down on the couch to make it look like I was under the influence of narcotics. Excuse me. A short time later, the person who was the focus, at that time, of my control efforts entered the room. He looked around, saw the spoon, saw me, and started to react. I jumped off the couch and started lecturing. "See?" I screamed. See how it feels to love someone and see them using chemicals? See how much it hurts? See what you've been doing to me for these years? His reaction was not nearly as important as my neighbor's reaction later that evening. What you're doing is really crazy, she said, and you need to go to Al-Anon. It took me months to learn the truth. I didn't need to prove to the alcoholic how much I hurt. I needed to become aware of how much pain I was in. I needed to take care of myself. That's only one of the many incidents that shows the lengths I went to control people. I was so good at seeing the behaviors, especially the out-of-control behaviors of another, yet I couldn't see unmanageability in my own life. I couldn't see myself, and I was trapped, locked in the victim role. People didn't just do things, they did things to me. No matter what happened, each event felt like a pointed attempt to do me in. My ability to separate myself from others, to separate my issues, my business, my affairs, and my responsibilities from the issues, business, affairs, and responsibilities of others, was non-existent. I blended into the rest of the world like an amoeba. If someone needed something, I considered that need my personal and private responsibility, even if I was just guessing about what he or she needed. If someone had a feeling, it was my responsibility to work through it for him or her. If someone had a problem, it was mine to solve. I didn't know how to say no. I didn't have a life of my own. I had a backlog of feelings from childhood. And chances were great that whatever I was reacting to today was probably a patterned reaction from childhood. 2 weeks after I got married, I raced home from work, flung open the closet doors, and checked to see if my husband's clothes were still in the closet. I was certain I was going to be abandoned, left. I felt totally unlovable. I didn't have the foggiest idea what it meant to own my power. The base I operated from was fear, coupled with low self-esteem. I spent most of my time reacting to other people, trying to control them, allowing them to control me, and feeling confused by it all. I thought I was doing everything right. Aren't people supposed to be perfect? Aren't people supposed to be stoic? Shouldn't we keep pushing forward no matter how much it hurts? Isn't it good to give until it hurts? Then keep giving until we're doubled over in pain? And how can we allow others to go about their life course? Isn't it our job to stop them, set them straight? Isn't that the right way, the good way, the Christian way, the codependent way? As many others have said about themselves, I wasn't me. I was whoever people wanted me to be. And I felt quite victimized and used up by it all. After years of practicing hardline codependency, the unmanageability in my life was overwhelming. Some of my codependency I didn't understand until well into recovery. When I began recovery, I was more than $50,000 in debt as a result of the unmanageability in my financial affairs. No amount was too great to be borrowed if it would help someone else. My spirituality had been taxed to the limit. How many times had I prayed for God to change other people? How often had I prayed for God? How often had God refused? I thought God had abandoned me. I didn't know that I had abandoned myself. I didn't know that now that I was an adult, people could not abandon me. All they could do was leave. In some instances, I may have been better off if they had. My relationships with my children were chaotic. It's hard to be an effective parent when you're bound up in pain, denial, and repressed feelings, and are regularly wishing for death. My relationships with friends were strained. I had little to offer friends. except my perpetual complaints about the misery in my life. Most of my friendships centered around shared stories of victimization, interspersed with rebellion humor to make it bearable. I don't know that word. Rabelaisan. Rebellion. Okay, guess who used me today? I had no feeling that I was aware of. If I had no needs that I was aware of, I prided myself on my ability to endure endless suffering, deprive myself, and go without. I neglected my career. My health was failing. I spent years seeking medical treatment for non-specific viruses. I had a hysterectomy. I had viral meningitis. I had gastritis. My back hurt. My head ached. Arthritis was beginning to settle in. I was only 32 years old. Codependency is a powerful force. So is denial and the ability to ignore what is before our eyes. What's there has the power to hurt, especially when we feel helpless, vulnerable, frightened, and ashamed by it all. Alright, now we're rolling into Stanley's story. Again, I gotta get another drink. Hang on. Stay with me, friends. Oh my god, it's so good this morning. Okay. Stanley's story. Stanley is a successful architect in his 50s. It took him 16 years to notice the unmanageability and chaos in his life. 16 years of denying, putting up with, pretending, and going deeper into hiding within himself before he saw the truth. Stanley's father is an alcoholic. Stanley's wife's father died of alcoholism, and after 16 years of trying to control his youngest son, Stanley reached the point of emotional collapse. By the time our youngest son, John, was 6, I knew we were in trouble, Stanley said. He constantly fought at school. He was belligerent and refused to do his homework. At home, he caused problems. He hollered at his mother, swore at her, and sometimes hit her. My wife and I fought all the time. I tried to be understanding. She had special circumstances. She had been in the camps during World War II, and she believed children should be loved and adored. She didn't want us to discipline John. John caused complete chaos at home. He was bright. He knew how to push everyone's buttons. He had my wife and I fighting, his siblings and I fighting. He even had his grandparents going at it. When John was 10, Stanley gave his wife an ultimatum. Either they sought professional help for John and the family, or Stanley was moving out. They went to a psychologist who told them not to worry. John, the psychologist said, was a bright child, a bit precocious, but he'd grow out at this stage. That session was the beginning of $20,000 after insurance coverage of fruitless family counseling. When John was 11, Stanley's wife threw up her arms in despair and walked out of a school counseling session. She was tired. She had given all she could to the situation. She vowed never to set foot inside a school again. A short time later, she moved out, leaving Stanley to raise the 3 children alone. Wow. By the time John was 12, Stanley was spending more time in school than John. Stanley was there 3 days a week, explaining why John was only there 2 days a week. The only way I could get John graduated from 9th to 10th grade was by promising to leave that school system, Stanley said. How codependent is that? I sold our home and moved to another school system so the school would graduate John. On one occasion, Stanley came home to find his middle son Jeremy choking John. Jeremy had his hands around John's neck and had lifted him off the ground. Jeremy quietly said that he had put up with John for 12 years and could do it no longer. Another time, Stanley walked into a room just as John was throwing a knife at another child. Stanley was able to deflect the course of the knife, causing it to pierce a window screen instead of the boy. When John was 16, things came to a head. By then, Stanley's wife had moved back home. One Sunday, Stanley was in the den watching football, and his wife was in the kitchen preparing brunch. John walked into the kitchen and began arguing with his mother. Stanley listened as their discussion escalated and their voices grew louder. "I was afraid," Stanley said. John still acted abusively toward his mother, hollering at her and sometimes hitting her. "I wasn't going to let that happen again." Stanley walked into the kitchen just as John was about to strike his mother. Stanley grabbed John and restrained him in a bear hug. When he did this, his wife came to John's rescue. She started pulling at Stanley, trying to get him to let John loose. Then Jeremy, the middle son, walked into the kitchen. He started pulling at his mother, trying to get her to leave Stanley alone so he could restrain John. The four of them toppled to the floor. Stanley cut his head open. Blood gushed out. Stanley let John loose, ran to the car, drove to the emergency room at the hospital, received 45 stitches, and then drove back home. There in the living room stood Jeremy and John toe-to-toe. They were still going at it. "They were ready to duke it out," said Stanley. "My wife was standing next to them, watching. She didn't know what to do. The boys were fully grown. John was 6 feet tall and weighed 175 pounds. Both of them had been trained in martial arts. Damn it, Stanley. If there's going to be any fighting around here, I'm going to do it," said Stanley. Then Stanley stepped in between the two boys and punched them both. The next day, Jeremy moved out. A few weeks later, the oldest sister moved out. 2 weeks after that, Stanley moved out. 2 months later, Stanley's wife moved out. A 16-year-old boy had gained complete control of the house and 2 dogs, Stanley said. "That was it. I moved back in." 2 weeks later, a school counselor called Stanley. "I think you've got a problem," she said. The counselor then informed Stanley that John was using drugs and had been using since he was 8 years old, a fact that $20,000 worth of counseling and therapy had failed to reveal. By then, when he wasn't dealing with the school or police officials, Stanley was spending his days locked in his office, head down on his desk, crying. "I was drained and felt totally devoid of any worth as a human being," Stanley said. Stanley began attending Al-Anon, then Families Anonymous. He was ready to face and accept his powerlessness and the unmanageability in his own life. He was ready to detach and begin taking care of himself. The epilogue to the story is this: John went to treatment but wasn't successful. Later on, after going to jail on a narcotics sale charge, he began a true recovery. He is now a successful businessman and has a close relationship with his father. Stanley and his wife divorced. Jeremy and the oldest sister are not yet in recovery for codependency. Stanley has lost 100 pounds. He exercises regularly and he feels peaceful and hopeful about life, and he takes care of himself daily. Okay, we're on page 12, and we've got to get to page 29 to be done with this chapter. It seems like some people have showed up here and decided to park exactly right here. So, I'm going to try to add a little bit more to this one. So here on page 12, we're going to go with other stories of unmanageability. But I'm not in that much trouble. you might be thinking. My response is, good. You don't have to be in a lot of trouble to recognize unmanageability and begin recovering from codependency. It takes many of us much pain to become ready for recovery. Others do not need as much chaos. Mike's awareness of the unmanageability in his life was a quiet one. I came home from work one night, and I could no longer stand my usual system of sitting in front of the television, staring at it and escaping from myself by reading the newspaper. My sister, who has always been borderline psychotic, called. She started going on, giving 15 different reasons for why she had lost her job. It was about the 15th one in a row she had lost, and the thought occurred to me that I could either go on with my life as it was, being bored and quietly escaping through the television, or I could start doing something different. Someone had given me the address of a 12-step group for adult children of alcoholics. I got up, turned off the television, and went to a meeting. I was ready to take the first step out of sheer boredom. Karen's unmanageability with her codependency became apparent while she was in recovery from addiction to drugs and alcohol. I had been recovering from chemical addiction for 15 years. I was doing everything everyone told me to. I was going to 5 meetings a week. I was helping people constantly, whether they wanted it or not. But inside, I was just as ashamed of myself as I was the day I got sober. I had no self-worth. I couldn't tell people no. I couldn't say what I thought. And everything I did to make people like me. From the way I dressed, to the way I combed my hair and put on my makeup, to the way I sat and the things I did for people. I felt so victimized. I never felt good enough. If I ever did say no or take care of myself with people, I felt so guilty. And I felt angry and resentful because my days and hours were consumed with doing things for people I felt I had to do. And people never seemed to appreciate what I did for them. I felt so bad about myself. I hoped that if I helped enough people, God would start treating me good. That's when it dawned on me that I needed to start treating myself good. God wasn't making me do all these things. God wasn't stopping the good from happening in my life. I was. I knew I needed, wanted, and deserved more from my sobriety than what I was getting. I came to understand that to get the more, I had to begin addressing my codependency. It was time. To use another author, Charlotte Castle's phrase, Karen was constantly giving more than she could afford to others and not giving to herself. A codependent behavior that ultimately creates unmanageability. We can give more of ourselves than we can afford, financially or emotionally. Anytime our giving begins to get compulsive or is induced by feelings of guilt and obligation, or leaves us feeling victimized, we are in danger. Anytime we're uncomfortable with what we're doing because it goes against our own truth and what we want, we are in danger. Consistently giving more than our share and not getting our needs met in relationships can create unmanageability. After ending a relationship and staying away from love relationships for a while, Martha met Jack. He really charmed her one evening, in the early days of their relationship, when he drove her to the train station and carried her bags to the platform for her. No man had ever done anything like that for me in my life, she said. It was love at first sight. The problems began subtly and were hard to identify. Jack told her early on that once she got to know him, she wouldn't like him. Jack was right. He seemed to want to control my opinions and thinking, Martha said. Whenever I voiced an opinion that was different than his, even if it was about a piece of art, he would argue with me until I gave in and agreed with him. Whenever it came time to be close, Jack withdrew. He would have sexual relations with Martha, but he refused to spend the night with her. He would go for long periods without seeing her, then make a date, and then at the last minute he would cancel. The relationship evolved into long conversations on each other's answering machines. My friends kept telling me this relationship was no good, Martha said, but I had a hard time seeing it. I couldn't break loose. I got stuck, trapped in it. It caused me a lot of pain. My self-esteem dropped. I cried a lot and sat waiting by the phone. I stopped trusting myself. Finally, Martha began attending meetings of CODA. Soon she was able to terminate the relationship and began taking care of herself. Martha learned that giving away her power and allowing herself to be victimized created unmanageability in her relationship and her life. She also began to look at and change some of the underlying reasons she had done this. We will too in the chapters on the 4th and 5th steps. Alright, I'm going to stop here because we'll do the last right at 15 pages on the next video. The next part is our lives had become unmanageable. All of this is going to be going over step 1, and it's targeting codependency, which is another term for co-alcoholism, as it turns out. That if you're around any alcoholism at all or drug addiction, then you have a certain set of necessary survival skills, and you wouldn't have made it without them. So I appreciate you being with me this morning and letting me read my new old book to you. Have a beautiful day.